Hello there. So I have a fun little passage from Thus Spake Zarathustra once again, and I'm going to go ahead and read it and give my thoughts on it. And this is from chapter 13, and it's called Chastity. So I'll have a link in the description for anyone who wants to read along. And yeah, I love the forest. It is bad to live in cities. There are too many of the lustful. Is it not better to fall into the hands of a murderer than into the dreams of a lustful woman? And just look at these men. Their eyes say it. They know nothing better on earth than to lie with a woman. Filth is at the bottom of their souls, and alas, if their filth hath still spirit in it. Would that ye were perfect, at least as animals, but to animals belongeth innocence. Do I counsel you to slay your instincts? I counsel you to innocence in your instincts. Do I counsel you to chastity? Chastity is a virtue with some, but with many almost a vice. These are continent, to be sure, but doggish lust looketh enviously out of all that they do. Even into the heights of their virtue, and into their cold spirit doth this creature follow them with its discord. And how nicely can doggish lust beg for a piece of spirit when a piece of flesh is denied it? Ye love tragedies and all that breaketh the heart, but I am distrustful of your doggish lust. Ye have too cruel of eyes, and ye look wantonly towards the sufferers. Hath not your lust just disguised itself, and taken the name of fellow suffering? And also this parable give I unto you. Not a few who meant to cast out their devil went thereby into the swine themselves. To whom chastity is difficult, it is to be dissuaded, lest it become the road to hell, to filth and lust of soul. Do I speak of filthy things? That is not the worst thing for me to do. Not when the truth is filthy, but when it is shallow, doth the discerning one go unwillingly into its waters. Verily, there are chaste ones from their very nature. They are gentler of heart, and laugh better and oftener than you. They laugh also at chastity, and ask, what is chastity? Is chastity not folly? But the folly came unto us, and not we unto it. We offered that guest harbour and heart. Now it dwelleth with us. Let it stay as long as it will. Thus spake Zarathustra. So before I go line by line, we can observe that the title of the chapter is Chastity, and the primary topic of the chapter is this lustfulness of human beings. And obviously, in some sense, he's referring to sexual lust, but I think he's referring more so to a lustful desiring, a modality of being wherein the kind of carnal instincts and the urge to engage in some kind of sensory gratification overcomes the soul and takes control of the person and becomes the guiding spirit, so to speak, or the guiding force that guides that person's behavior. So just kind of keeping that in mind as we go into the depths of these words. I love the forest. It is bad to live in cities. There are too many of the lustful. So the forest would be the more natural world, and the cities would be the more artificial world, where men have constructed these artifices of worlds that are less imbued with the numinous force of nature, so to speak. And we have to remember that Nietzsche is the philosopher who is very much against the rabble. And by the rabble, he really means these people who are just addicted to vice and sensory gratification and lives of meaninglessness, essentially. And so when he's talking about living in the forest, he's talking about, or loving the forest, he loves a more connected, meaningful modality of being. Whereas in the cities, you have this energetic pollution of the rabble, so to speak. So the next line, is it not better to fall into the hands of a murderer than into the dreams of a lustful woman? So, in a literal sense, he's saying that he would rather die than to fall victim to the control, so to speak, of a lustful woman who would kind of tame him through his sexual energy, take control of him by stealing the creative force, the libido, from him. He would rather use that libido on something else. He would rather die than to have that libido stolen from him. But then in a more metaphorical sense, we might think of a more archetypal succubus-like force that, kind of like I'm talking about, that is trying to take your libido away and nourish herself with it. So whatever kind of force that may be, whether it be like pornography or just the mass technocratic web that might be some kind of spider web that would have some kind of feminine energy to it. Not necessarily saying that's the only kind of energy in there, but we might make that case. And he would rather die than to become a commodity for such an archetypal force, so to speak. And actually, I quickly mentioned pornography. I will say that from my perspective, in a more energetic, spiritual sense, I view the pornographic industry as literally one gigantic succubus. So if you're still doing that, you're literally feeding a demonic energy, a gigantic cyber demonic entity that is a succubus that feeds literally upon your sexual energy and libido to create a system of like sex trafficking and enslavement and probably a lot of torture and trauma and darkness and absolutely horrible demonic spaces. So eradicate that from your life. That is a very good idea, because you don't want to produce such a reality with your creative life force and libido. So anyway, and just look at these men. Their eyes say it. They know nothing better on earth than to lie with a woman. Filth is at the bottom of their souls, and alas, if their filth hath still spirit in it. So this passage is, first off, fairly relatable, I'm sure, to many men on a personal level. For me, at least, it is, because back in the day when I was kind of into spirituality, but I wasn't like actually into it. All I cared about was chasing girls around. Like in college, instead of like reading the readings, I would just like go party and hang out with girls and things like that. So I relate to that on a very personal level when he says, their eyes say it. They know nothing better on earth than to lie with a woman. It's like you become possessed by this urge, which is kind of an evolutionary urge, I guess, to procreate. But then you get caught up in that cycle, and it's really empty and doesn't really bring anything about. So that's on a literal level. But then he's more talking about the lustful way of being. So you might imagine a kind of zombified consumer type human being who's lustfully chasing after women, not women, but the pleasure of any kind of behavior. And that pleasure and that sensory gratification becomes hypnotic. And their eyes begin to speak of that hypnosis. Their eyes begin to look soulless, and filth is at the bottom of their souls. You can see even some filth in their eyes that not only reaches their eyes and their bodies, but begins to reach into the soul and contaminate the soul itself, contaminate their spirit, which is supposed to remain pure. And here we're talking about a redirection of free will in accordance with false pleasures and lower base carnal lustful desires. And free will is not meant to be controlled by such urges. it is rather meant to take control of those urges and transmute them in accordance with the will. So we'll see what else he has to say. Would that ye were perfect, at least as animals, but to animals belongeth innocence. Do I counsel you to slay your instincts? I counsel you to innocence in your instincts. Do I counsel you to chastity? Chastity is a virtue with some, but with many almost a vice. So when he says that animals belong to this state of innocence, rather the state of innocence belongs to animals, I think he's saying something like animals reside in the more harmonious state of nature and divine alignment, just inherently, whereas human beings have kind of severed themselves from that. And so when he speaks of slaying your instincts, he asks, should you slay your instincts? He says, I counsel you to innocence in your instincts. So he's not saying like completely detach yourself from your instincts, because your instincts are an essential part of who you are. They are mechanisms of the divine order of things, so to speak, that flow through you and into you to create a more human version of yourself, so that you can be fully human and authentic, so to speak. So by counseling us to innocence in our instincts, he's saying, let your instincts flow out of you in a way that is in accordance with, he would disagree with higher order, but I'm just going to call it higher order because, well, that's how I'm going to interpret it. And then he asks, do I counsel you to chastity? Chastity is a virtue with some, but with many almost a vice. So he's essentially asking, like, do you need to reject the material world and all material pleasure and just kind of dedicate yourself to spirit and truth and whatever? For some, that might be the path, but for most people, he's saying no, because that's not a natural process, and that's not going to lead to a natural kind of free-flowing, divinely aligned result. And then you're just going to bring these lustful ways of being and these lustful desires over into another category of being. And he goes into that a little further. So, these are continent, to be sure, but doggish lust looketh enviously out of all that they do. Even into the heights of their virtue, and into their cold spirit, doth this creature follow them with its discord. And how nicely can doggish lust beg for a piece of spirit, when a piece of flesh is denied it? So what he's saying here is, for some people, essentially, if you're trying to suppress this carnal desire, this lustful desire, and this way of being that emerges out of these more instinctive forces, then all of that energy is just going to get bottled up. And it's not just going to disappear, it's just going to accrue energy. And eventually that energy is going to have to come out. And let's say that you dedicate yourself to a more spiritual life by suppressing these desires, then those desires and the modality of being that comes with such desires will only replicate themselves in your more spiritual life. And then you'll just seek gratification from your spiritual life as opposed to seeking gratification from the material world. Now, instead, in a more kind of virtuous way of using this force of transmuting these energies, you would align yourself with your instincts. You would kind of inquire into the energy of these instincts and their natural state in such a way that doesn't take possession of you and your soul and your spirit. And you see how you might find some way to dance harmoniously with such energies. And in dancing harmoniously with such energies, bring and create transmutations and emanations of that energy into the world in a way that is beautiful and naturally aligned in a state of innocence, like that he's talking about in the kind of state of harmony that the animals find themselves in the natural world. And so he goes further into this, and he says, "And also this parable give I unto you. Not a few who meant to cast out their devil went thereby into the swine themselves. To whom chastity is difficult, it is to be dissuaded, lest it become the road to hell, to filth and lust of soul." So he's speaking of these people who are trying to get rid of these demonic energies, these demonic urges, so to speak, these lustful ways of being, and they're not necessarily capable of doing so. They don't have the willpower, they don't have the personality, they don't have whatever it might be. And those kinds of people might be living in a world at the time that he's writing where something like an institution, like a church, would be saying, reject the material world, only spirituality exists. Like, most people aren't cut out for spirituality. And so most people, as they might force themselves for some reason or other into such a life, would turn into swine. Where does it say this? Went thereby into the swine themselves. And I just read somewhere recently that there is this Greek goddess or something that turns humans into pigs, and then the pigs would represent gluttony, and this kind of same energy of what Nietzsche is talking about, this lustful way of being, except more so in the food consumption world. Like, pigs will literally eat anything, and there are human beings who essentially live like pigs and just are drowned in gluttony. So he says, to whom chastity is difficult, it is to be dissuaded. So if that kind of life where you reject entirely this lustful way of being is too difficult for you, then that's not necessarily the life for you. Every human being has his or her own kind of path and a way of being in the world, this authentic, this way towards the highest form of authenticity. And if like eradicating your lustful behavior is not part of that, then maybe that's not the path for you. I do personally think that human beings being more connected to spirit as opposed to false pleasures is probably a good thing for just about anyone, but rejecting them entirely might not be the true path. Maybe simply getting to know them, getting more in tune with them, and then taking control. That would be a better alternative. And so he says, do I speak of filthy things? That is not the worst thing for me to do. Not when the truth is filthy, but when it is shallow, doth the discerning one go unwillingly into its waters. So when the truth is shallow, I think of a superficial truth that has been presented to the masses, which is true, and it contains the essence of truth. But it is presented on kind of this silver platter that makes people comfortable, that doesn't challenge people to explore the kind of darker realms of truth. But here Nietzsche is saying that it's more in this filthy world of truth, or rather, when you're really a discerning one who is looking for the truth with a capital T, so to speak, that you might realize that there is darkness hidden in the truth, and that you have to come to terms with that darkness and find ways around that darkness within the world, instead of just completely suppressing that and then presenting like just a superficial truth to everybody. You have to integrate the darkness into the truth, present it to people, make people aware that this darkness exists, and then not just focus on the darkness and say, oh, it's the end because this darkness exists and it's true, blah, blah, blah. Rather, transmute that darkness into a more aligned, authentic, beautiful version of the truth. Something along those lines. That sounds tangential, but I think is related. And so I'll just read on. Verily, there are chaste ones from their very nature. They are gentler of heart and laugh better and oftener than you. They laugh also at chastity and ask, what is chastity? Is chastity not folly? But the folly came unto us, and not we unto it. We offered that guest harbor and heart. Now it dwelleth with us. Let it stay as long as it will. Thus spake Zarathustra. So he's basically saying, he's concluding this passage by kind of saying, some people are born to be chaste and to take control of these more lustful desires and modalities of being, whereas some other people simply aren't. They have a different kind of path, so to speak. And with these people who are inherently more chaste, inherently more inclined to live a more kind of spiritual life and a more willful life, let's say, such people, they won't even necessarily recognize that there's no like effort being placed on controlling your desires. They've aligned themselves with some kind of purpose, which I would call divine. And once that purpose, the divine purpose is achieved, then it's not like, oh, I'm putting effort into resisting these urges and pushing them away from me in order to go live this other life. Rather, they have seamlessly aligned themselves with whatever reality throws at them. And they have taken control of how they react to whatever reality throws at them. They have taken control of the kind of reality that they will create as a response to what reality throws at them. Now, such people laugh and they ask, what is chastity? Is chastity not folly? But the folly came unto us, and not we unto it. So he's saying it's not of their own necessarily of their own volition that they chose to reject these desires and to go live a more spiritual life. It's like inherently within themselves, within the deepest well springs of their being, there was this more spiritual impulse, let's say. And it's not like they chose to let go of everything and then this spiritual impulse came about. It's more so this spiritual impulse was there, and it was so powerful that it became the steer of behavior. And they simply chose to let that folly align with every one of their actions. We offered that guest harbor and heart. Now it dwelleth with us. Let it stay as long as it will. So this higher modality of being just kind of seamlessly appeared. And they noticed it because they were aligned and in tune with their bodies and their emotions and their spirit and just their entire essence of being. Instead of denying all pleasure, all material, all reality, they inquired deep into their innermost selves, and they discovered this kind of more chaste way of being, this more spiritual way of being. And they recognize that being as something that they've been given by whatever forces gave us being in the first place, be it God, be it like the chaotic force of the unknown that Nietzsche might worship. And they say, let the world throw at us what it will, and we will live our lives in accordance with our will. We will transmute whatever the world throws at us energetically into the realities that we wish to create. And that path that is implied in such behavior, that path of recognizing yourself for who you truly are without rejecting any aspect of who you are, but rather fully embracing what the world has offered you in this embodied form of being, then you take greater control of your life. And you get to live a life not dictated by rejecting everything that's thrown at you, but rather affirming that something has been thrown at you and it's in your hands. It's your responsibility to react in such a way that will be most fruitful for you. So I think that's what this whole kind of passage is about. That it begins by saying, I love the forest. It is bad to live in cities. There are too many of the lustful. And I think we have to remember that that's the setting of the text, because the forest might represent the more naturally aligned state, whereas the city will represent the more artificial state. And it's in the forest that the more spiritual way of being, the less lustful way of being, that we become the most pure versions of ourselves, so to speak. Meanwhile, in the cities, the kind of behavior that's being cultivated is not divinely aligned behavior and purity. It's a more lustful kind of behavior based on desire and impulse and just pure sensory gratification. And the source of such gratification in the city is artificial. It is fabricated. It is superficial. Whereas in the forest, it is deep, pure, and natural. So whether we take these realms literally or more metaphorically, both cases hold vast amounts of truth. When you're out in the mountains, in the forests, in the natural world, and you're in that stillness, it's far easier to be in tune with yourself and to recognize how you might overcome your desires, not in a way that rejects them, but rather aligns them with your higher will. Whereas when you're in the city and everyone's just doing the 9 to 5, like rat race kind of thing, and there's all this machinery everywhere and gas and pollution and trash everywhere, it's a lot more difficult to be aligned, both literally and figuratively. There's all that noise. And then you conflate your own identity and your own will with the identities of others and the wills of others, and maybe even all the rabble and the trash and the pollution that's around. And so that seamless way of transmuting the energies of desire doesn't come about. Rather, you get caught up in the cycle of meaningless vice that the city has to offer. So instead, you have to go to the forest. Be it the forest that's actually like an hour away and you go hiking there, or the forest of stillness that you might find deep within yourself by inquiring into who you are and what you are, and recognizing that this is the being that you've been given, and that you're in this forest, and there's no way out of the forest, so you better just learn to live among the trees or something like that, and learn to find the stillness rather than go get stuck in the lustful ways of the city, so to speak. So it's not about a rejection of all gratification, of all lustful behavior, but rather an affirmation of the beauties and the ugliness that this world has given you, and an acceptance that your life is entirely your own responsibility, insofar as it's up to you to react to what the forest and the city has to offer. In the end, it's up to you to transmute the energies. And when you're most aligned with your most natural state, it's not about forcing anything. Everything will just flow seamlessly out of you. I think that's the essence of the passage. So, thus spake Zarathustra.